Welcome to Feminist Economics and Policy Initiative, or FEPI, as we like to call ourselves, first ever guest lecture. Thank you so much for joining in on a Saturday afternoon. I am Tanya Rana, and I have founded FEPI with Suparna Agarwal and Tejusi Panjiar. We are very excited to share this virtual space with you and introduce you to Professor Dr. Kaveri Tara. Professor Kaveri is a legal and political anthropologist. Currently, she is an associate professor and the associate dean of international affairs at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, OP Jindal Global University. She is also a visiting fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, formerly Brookings India, and was a North-South Mobility Fellow at the Institute for Research on Development, Paris 2019. Professor Kaveri studied law at the University Law College, Bangalore, and obtained a master's and a PhD in development studies from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva. Her talk today is on gender and the urban poor, which is a theme she draws from her recent book, In Search of Home, Citizenship, Law, and the Politics of the Poor, published by Cambridge University Press. Now, before we get into the lecture, I want to very briefly share the vision of FEPI and how it was conceptualized as a student-led society at the School of Government and Public Policy, Jindal Global University. Economics, or rather mainstream approaches to understanding economics as a discipline, needs to expand knowledge creation. But how can we really go about this? To start with, we can listen to the voices of those identities who have been pushed to the margin in this discipline. We can introduce and start accepting different methodologies and analytical lenses of viewing the economy too. The feminist conceptualization of the economy is one such analytical and methodological and philosophical lens that considers a gendered view of the economy. Now, I borrow a phrase from Jayati Ghosh's amazing series of lectures on feminist economics that says, and I quote this, "Gender cross-cuts household, families, caste, race, religion, and other social categories in any economy or society." FEPI, as a consequence of this lacuna in mainstream approach of academic economics, has been founded on the premise of spotlighting the narratives of gendered identities, lived realities of the world around them and their interactions with the economy. Through our effort at Jindal Global University, which hopefully will extend even beyond its premises, we want to be able to play a small but crucial part in channelizing this into community-level programs and policies that are truly inclusive. This, we believe, has to advance from the ground up. And we are truly very grateful that JGU gave us the space to initiate such a feat. The hope of this initiative is that students of economics and even other disciplines will go on to challenge in their own curriculums and spaces of interactions the current biases and status quo of hierarchical relations. I'm sorry about the background noise if that seems to be disturbing you. So in terms of how we plan to operationalize our vision into activities such as guest lectures, reading clubs, workshops, etc., we will be kind of hosting this platform and keeping our website open for participation across JGU and even beyond it. And we also have a working blog, and anyone who is interested can write for us. We have made it as a matter of principle to incorporate and give preference to voices hitherto unheard in mainstream economic and policy research. So our research and editorial team will be deep diving into certain themes within the bracket of feminist economics, such as unpaid labor and care work, home-based production, gender budgeting, and so on. And this will be done on a monthly basis. And we hope to tailor our conversations, our activities of lectures, writing, blog writing, reading club, etc., on these themes. Our social media and outreach team will be consistently updating the website and social media. We are currently active on Twitter and LinkedIn with all the interesting activities that we are up to. Moving on and coming back to the guest lecture, I will share a few housekeeping guidelines. Please do keep yourself on mute and your web cameras off. You are most welcome to drop in your questions in the Zoom chat box during Professor Kaveri's 30 to 40 minutes talk. And Tejasvi will be moderating all your questions at the end of the talk. Suparna will then bring today's session to a close with a vote of thanks. Now, without further ado, I request Professor Kaveri to please commence her talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanya. So good afternoon, and thank you to all of those who have taken the time out on a Saturday, which could have been spent in a more relaxed manner, to be here today with us. Just to sort of start off this discussion, and also perhaps as an introduction to FEPI that Tanya just introduced you to. I would also like to say perhaps a few words about this chapter, which is part of my book. So today I will present actually just one chapter in the book, and the gendered analysis actually runs through the entirety of the book. The title of the book is In Search of Home: Citizenship, Law and the Politics of the Poets. It's just been published this year in 2021 by the Cambridge University Press in the South Asia in Social Sciences series. This book has taken me quite a few years to write. I started writing it in January 2017 when I relocated to the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And I must say that as a single parent, it was much more challenging for me to finish this book. JGU made it possible to work on this book in a certain sense, and therefore I express my thanks for the conducive writing environment it provided me. Flexible working hours, manageable teaching hours, and manageable administrative work, the lack of mandatory attendance of conferences and events, which I hear in many other parts of India are quite, strictly imposed. Now, all of this allowed me to write this book. I must also say that COVID struck a very large blow on the progress of my writing, and it affected me very much like the many other female academics who have seen their writing and research suffer during this pandemic. In kickstarting this wonderful feminist economics and policy initiative by Tanya, Tejasvi, and Aparna, I would like to express my empathies because I think this is much more than sympathy. It's an empathy. I have also undergone this to all those women whose writing has always suffered and has suffered even more so during this pandemic. Women academics, as much as we would like to think that in a certain sense we are above all of this, we are also steeped in domestic obligations, care and reproductive work, just as the women who populate my book, which I will discuss today. Even if we are, in a certain sense, far more privileged, obviously, than these poor women that I'm going to discuss today, the academic production of knowledge in which we partake and the academic environment in which we exist is perhaps oblivious to the added charge we bear as compared to our male counterparts. So in a true feminist spirit, I'm confident that the Feminist Economics and Policy Initiative would provide a forum for feminist intellectuals to come together and showcase their work, all the work that we are doing, even the little bits that we are able to produce, but also make apparent the conditions in which we produce this work. So without much ado, I'd like to begin. I'll just shut off my video so you can focus on the screen. All right. Okay, thanks, Tanya. While my book examines urban poor struggles for housing and services, I have used a critical gender lens in my ethnography, examining not just what happens on the field, but also reflecting on the state of studies available on the topic and trying to find, in a certain sense, my own position within this literature. Most studies of urban poor collective struggles have focused on class over gender, and this is understandable. There are, of course, some very notable exceptions. For instance, Ananya Roy's work on the squatter women in Kolkata, and Iona Datta's work on squatters in Delhi, the squatter women in Delhi. Now, this focus on class is not surprising, as what most research has been interested in examining is essentially this question of how slums are able to stay put, how the poor are able to survive in cities despite being illegal residents and despite the various laws and state mechanisms to evict them. There has been a marked focus on slum leadership. For instance, Veena Das's explorations of the qualities that effective slum leaders possess to ensure the slum is not evicted and that it has access to basic amenities. The politics of the poor is therefore, in a certain sense, hinged on often male leadership of slums and settlements or other similarly placed male interlocutors. Here I'm reminded of the primary school teacher Anadi Bera in Partha Chatterjee's Politics of the Governed, who created a People's Welfare Association in Rail Colony Gate Number 1 slum, involving, including the support of the local elected representatives, the bureaucrats, as well as drawing a lot of support from middle-class households nearby, as a sort of a strategy to evade evictions. Now, collective struggles have also been studied at the micro level, not just at the meso level, as I just recounted, but also at the micro level, with authors exploring everyday politics in their work. Here I refer to the work of Julia Eckert on informal settlements in Delhi and the forms of citizenship, citizen engagement one finds here. The work of Asif Bayat in the Middle East, as well as James Holston in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Now, in these works, gender sometimes appears, but in a very transitory manner, with very little work that focuses on gendered relations within poor communities and the manner in which these gendered relations enable this everyday politics or the politics of the poor. On going through, it's the previous slide only, Tanya. On going through this vast and rich literature, a question I asked myself is whether women engage in the politics of the poor at all. And if so, in what ways is this politics gendered? Next slide. A brief introduction to my field. My study was located in Bangalore in Laggere slum quarters, as it is commonly referred to, which is one of the largest rehabilitation areas. Rehabilitation areas are essentially, large tracts of land often found in the peripheries of the city, where subsidized houses are provided to slum groups that are evicted from other slums in the city, within the city. Now, Laggere is actually a 54-acre plot of land. And in 2009, when I started my research, it had about 4,000 families living in it. And obviously this number has been increasing since. Now, as I said, this in the 1980s, the very first groups of evicted slum dwellers were relocated in Laggere. And when they were relocated, this area was actually outside the Bangalore Municipal Corporation area. It was therefore very poorly serviced. There were actually no services. Women had to walk 2 kilometers to fetch water from a neighborhood far away. And they had absolutely no other amenities, just a set of buildings in the middle of nowhere. But today, in 2009, when I started my work, essentially, this area had already become a part of the Bangalore Municipal Corporation area and had been developed. And as I will argue today in this talk, a lot of this development was thanks to the everyday politics that primarily women were engaged in at the neighborhood level. Between 2009 and 2015, 6 years of longitudinal ethnography that I conducted in this area, it further densified. There were a lot of new buildings that began to be constructed here, primarily under the NERM project, that's the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission project. And so I also saw a steady stream of groups which were coming into the slum. So my sample essentially consisted of 50 families that had been living. I'm sorry, not the slum, it's a rehabilitation area. My sample essentially consisted of 50 families living in Lagere, but I also worked with a Dalit organization located in Lagere, which was working with several other slum groups in various parts of Bangalore, enabling their access to rehabilitation housing, both within Lagere as well as in other rehabilitation areas in Bangalore. Now, through this organization, I followed up 3 groups of newly rehabilitated slum dwellers in Lagere, examining how they organized and mobilized for housing. Next slide. My research has focused on the micropolitics of neighborhoods, examining how residents in Lagere, who despite possessing legal housing, have absolutely no access to basic services and therefore have had to engage with local elected representatives, the councillor in the area, the MLA in the area, to access just very basic amenities such as water, electricity, and sanitation. The second issue I explore are struggles for rehabilitation housing. Now, these struggles are both within Lagere and outside Lagere. As I said earlier, there are lots of slums outside who are also mobilizing, and they would prefer to reside in Lagere because it's now part of the city, as compared to residing in any other rehabilitation area, which is even further away from Bangalore and is therefore not accessible. But this housing is also sought by a lot of the residents who already live in Lagere for their children who are now grown up and are starting off families of their own. So these mobilizations were essentially what I focused on. Finally, I also looked at struggles for access to subsidized food, including access to the ration card, the organization of ration card drives in the area, the routine vigilance, the routine daily vigilance, essentially that people maintained over the nearby ration depot. What I found was that women were omnipresent in everyday politics and most active within neighborhoods. They were also referred to as leaders, just as male leaders, but they were a little different from the male leaders in the sense that they connected people, families in the streets that they lived in with leaders who were working with other men who worked very closely with the local councillor, very commonly referred to as the MLA's men or the municipal councillors' men. So these women essentially enable vote banks. And as one leader told me when I asked him, why do you even need these women? You are anyway living in Lagere, so can't you mobilize these people? So he said, well, no, these women are able to gather a lot of people for events and protests, as well as negotiations. And we cannot do that work as well as they do it. Since their collectivization enabled women to run their homes more efficiently, there was very little resistance or objection to these women engaging in neighborhood politics from other members of the family. And I observed that, in fact, it's older women with fewer care responsibilities who come to occupy these leading roles, mobilizing other younger women in the neighborhoods, building consensus, as well as negotiating political favors. Next slide. Paradoxically, women came to be involved in politics due to their reproductive roles, carrying out these various tasks that they are responsible for. Cooking, cleaning, bathing requires access to services. And hence the concerns of the domestic space, therefore, spills out into the space of the neighborhood. As Michel de Certeau notes, the neighborhood is a progressive privatization of public space, growing with the repetition of the dwellers' bodies' engagement in public space until it exercises a sort of appropriation of the space. This is especially true of urban poor neighborhoods where, for want of space, in tiny pigeonhole apartments where these people live, much of life is actually lived out in the open on the street. Children are bathed, clothes are washed and wrung out to dry, spices and lentils are dried and cleaned, BDs and agarbattis are rolled out in plain sight, and food is often partaken of at the doorstep of these tiny apartments. The poor neighborhood is therefore, as Lefebvre notes, an entrance and an exit between qualified spaces and quantified space, between the dwellings of people and the city. The neighborhood was therefore a benign space in which women could engage with other women under watchful eyes. It was considered sort of safe for women to congregate around the community hall, discuss their problems, and chart out a course of action to address them. Even if collective struggles of these women eventually took them far away to the doorstep of the councillor, to political events or rallies, or to state offices, the necessity of this work to enable the smooth functioning of homes, as well as the collective forms of struggles, which allows a certain kind of auto-policing by other women involved in these struggles, enables women's foray into politics with little or no resistance from other family members. Next slide. My work contrasts this everyday politics hidden in the folds of the street with a far more visible and performative politics and protests. I work closely with the members of a Dalit organization situated in Lagdere, as I said earlier, accompanying them in their work of negotiating rehabilitation homes, and also accompanying them in various protests, gheraos, as well as sit-ins, which they organized frequently in front of the Slum Development Board. Now, there's some literature here in the book on these middlemen, right? These are organizations that sort of represent urban poor groups. They stand in between slums and the state. So there's a good amount of literature, for instance, on Pyravikars that I have, worked on in this book, and I don't have time to go into that today. But also a very detailed analysis of how corruption is institutionalized in the slum board. Now, these mobilizations for housing are at the level of the slum, with slum leaders representing slums and working closely with members of this Dalit organization, who in turn have decades of experience working with the bureaucracy to enable access to rehabilitation housing. This Dalit organization, for instance, that I worked with, works very closely with slum leaders, training them on documenting, conducting surveys, filling various applications, including for the declaration of the slum, and creating a paper trail that strengthens the case of these poor groups for rehabilitation housing. Now, here, women as leaders of slums are too few and far between, and this work is considered more transgressive because it means these women have to work with the largely male Dalit organization, and also because it involves a substantial amount of work in state offices far away from home. For instance, one of the women leader that I interviewed, and that's the excerpt that you see here from her interview on the screen, she said, they, meaning referring to the Dalit organization, invited us to visit those people who have got houses through them, so that we too would feel that it is possible for such things to happen. They said, make a list, we will give it to the concerned people. I started going with them. My husband asked me not to go around like that. He said that they may keep saying all that, but it is really not a joke to get a house in Bangalore. He scolded me twice. So I kept quiet. Then as I kept coming back, I felt, why not go and see what it is? They were not getting anything out of us. If they are telling us all this so many times, there may be something worth knowing. Without the approval of my husband, though he said no to it, I went ahead. I would be back by the time he got back from work. When I started going around with them, I began to understand what the organization is all about. I later told my husband that we are doing all this. He used to be quiet sometimes. He used to have alcohol, and when he's drunk, he used to say all kinds of things. And she also told me later that some of these arguments would get quite violent. Next slide. Even if women leaders are exceptions, the urban poor woman is essential to protests, sit-ins, and gheraos for housing, organized by this Dalit organization. The image of the helpless poor woman in tattered clothes is often used to depict the plight of the urban poor. For instance, in a report of the PUCL on slum fires in 2006, the figure of the woman is used to describe the hardships and humiliation suffered by women. This is an excerpt from that report. In Jai Bhim Nagara and Vinayaka Badavani, there have been no human casualties, though several women and small children barely escaped the fire. In various interviews, the team came across various other tactics, including threatening, physical violence, using gundas, abusing the women, teasing women, etc., to force them off the land. This is an issue that needs immediate tackling. In all three slums, this was a fear that was expressed. Ratna, the slum leader that I quoted in the earlier slide, also spoke in similar lines while describing a recent slum eviction. Again, a week back, they have demolished it again. They have beaten up women. Men weren't around at that time as they had gone out for work. Police had gone into the slum at 12 in the afternoon. There were pregnant women, new mothers. They barged in and attacked them. A child died due to the attack. They took away all their things, including the rice they had kept in their houses. They burned the cover of their sheds. They didn't spare a thing. These discourses, therefore, gender the experience of poverty itself. The hardships of men are therefore not very, they're not projected very as much as the hardships experienced by women. And this is discursively used to illustrate the plight of the urban poor. Next slide. Women are therefore sought out and coaxed, I must say, coaxed with a lot of effort to participate in protests and are mobilized to join the Dalit organization to resist the state. Appeals are therefore made to their bravery. For example, in this poem, which is often sung in events in preparation of protests. Simmadante sididu banni, huliyante negadu banni, ಹೋರಾಟದ ಸಾಗರಕ್ಕೆ ನಾರಿಯರೇ ನಗುತ್ತ ಬನ್ನಿ, ವೀರ ನಾರಿಯರ ಮಡಿಲ ಧೀರ ನಾರಿಯರೇ ನೀವು, ಸಂಘದಲ್ಲಿ ಸೇರಿ ಬನ್ನಿ, ಸಂಘರ್ಷವೇ ಮಾಡಿ ಬನ್ನಿ. Come swift like a lion, spring forth like a tiger, to the ocean of struggle, women, come forth laughing. In the lap of gallant women, your spirited women, come join the association, come and struggle on. Now, this appeal to the bravery in women stands in stark contrast to the manner in which they are depicted in these protests, where women with babies or little children are sought for. Preparations for protests, for instance, I attended a few of these, were often sprinkled with instructions on what people ought to wear. In one session, women were told not to dress as if they were going for a wedding, suggesting they dress down rather than dress up. So perceptions are key in these protests, and women with breastfeeding children are a huge plus to elicit sympathies of otherwise coldly rational officers. Now, the poor women is therefore likened to warriors like Kittur Rani Chennamma and Vanake Obava, very well-known warriors in Karnataka. In this poem, which talks about these qualities of these women. And even as they are asked to come forth like warriors, they are at the same time called upon to display plight. Next slide. Thank you, Tanya. It is not just women's bodies that are employed to illustrate poverty, but also women's emotions that are strategically employed to elicit the sympathies of politicians and bureaucrats, and to, in a certain sense, sway discretionary powers to their advantage. As Lisa Bjorkman notes, mass politics operates within a theatrical register in which the participant audience is a vital part of a politically mediated, ostentatious display. Now, in this picture of a protest, this was a protest by vegetable vendors in quite a well-known locality in Bangalore, in Koramangala, and they were evicted from the pavements. This young, physically challenged woman stood silently at the fringes of a large group of shouting, protesting men, shouting out slogans. And on the arrival of the local MLA, was quickly thrust forward before him, weeping and pleading for help. Hochschild, whose concept of emotion work I rely on in my research, challenges the social psychology view of emotion as something that cannot be controlled and is therefore not governed by social rules, which are viewed as shaping other forms of behavior, but not emotion. Women's seemingly inability to control their emotions, though employed in protests, may not be so uncontrollable after all. Hochschild argues that social rules govern our capacities to shape emotion and distinguish between primary passive emotions and secondary acts performed upon these passive emotions. She notes that women are trained through childhood gender socialization and are called upon more than men to do more emotion work, and lacking other resources, women make a resource out of feeling. She suggests that the emotional arts that women have cultivated are analogous to the art of feigning. She notes that it has been in the interest of women and the lower class to be a better actor. She observes that these techniques of deep acting, long considered natural and a part of a woman's being, rather than something of her own making, have unusually high secondary gains. She argues that emotion work is a form of shadow labor relying on Ivan Illich's work, an unseen effort which, like housework, does not count as labor but is crucial to getting things done. These performances are therefore simultaneously in conformity with gender norms, just as they signify acts of resistance. Though the state works in concert with Dalit leaders, often making decisions on home allotments based on other considerations, notably corruption, and these displays of emotion in protest allows the state to justify these allotments, providing a human face or angle, or rather a gendered angle, to the employment of their discretion. Next slide, Tanya. The politics that I have described today, both everyday politics and the politics of protest, involve considerable time, efforts, and skills on the part of the urban poor. Poor women spend much of their time learning the state in order to make claims or demands. The skills I have discussed today are not limited to that of garnering emotion, eliciting sympathies, or employing emotion work, but include learning how to produce and manage documents, how to approach state officers, how to make requests so that they would be inclined to respond to them, who to approach to apply political pressure, how to navigate political networks without offending any of their supporters, and how to negotiate vote banks effectively to ensure the betterment of their own neighborhoods. What I've dealt with today is, in a sense, a partial exploration of what I suggest amounts to political work. something I'm further developing with my colleague Isabelle Guérin from the French Institute for Research on Development. In our earlier work on various women-led struggles in India, we grappled with the fact that many of the women we met had either retracted from paid work to mobilize for other necessities essential for the survival of their homes, or were in many cases forced to mobilize to protect their work from being taken away from them. This research has been a starting point for me to explore this concept of political work, to describe and understand forms of work that are not remunerated in traditional modes, but is essential all the same to the survival of the poor. Now, the Sage Encyclopedia defines work as purposeful human activity involving physical or mental exertion that is not undertaken solely for pleasure, and that has economic or symbolic value. And symbolic value meaning it could include maintaining communal ways of life and keeping communities together. There are clearly elements of work that we see in these collective struggles, apart from the mental and physical exertion involved, the time taken to attain the objectives. For instance, it takes slums many years, sometimes decades, to obtain housing. The skills that are developed by these women and employed in it, and the economic value it represents in improving their lives in the city, even if this economic value is not in the traditional form of a salary or income that is obtained while doing other forms of paid work. But why would this be political? Isn't it just work, plain and simple? Here we propose that the reason why this is political is because it seeks to transform the material conditions of those excluded from the ambit of citizenship. It is political because these struggles rely on the very laws that disempower them to claim access to housing and services that they have no rights under law to lay claim to. I suggest, therefore, that women perform an integral role in urban poor struggles, contributing much needed political work that lends to the development of neighborhoods and the improvement of the material conditions of life of the urban poor. Yeah, I think with this slide, I'm done with my presentation, and I look forward to your comments or questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaveri, for enlightening us on the conversation around gender relations in the politics of the poor, and sharing with us the ethnographic work that you conducted for your book. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. Now I would request Dr. Kaveri to answer some of the questions that were sent to us during the session. As a reminder, you may still submit your questions on the chat and we will address them. So ma'am, we have a question that says, it has been observed that gender roles and mobility are more strictly imposed for girls as compared to boys. Parents too tend to teach their children to adhere to inequitable gender norms. Does this early socialization have an impact on that political voice?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Tejasvi, I will respond to this, but I'm just also wondering, would people be able to actually ask their questions, or will they just send those questions on the comment box?
Ma'am, if you wish, we can definitely ask them to unmute and ask themselves.
Yeah, I think that would be a bit more interactive. So if you're okay with that, maybe that's good. But yes, I would like to take this question. This is a very good question. In my research, I've seen that this very deeply impacts the way in which girls perceive the opportunities that they have out there for them. So for instance, some of this socialization or the gendered socialization is also because of specific context. For instance, all of us are living in the northern part of India, in Delhi NCR belt. So all of us also know that the crimes against women here in this region are quite alarming. And we therefore sort of, adapt to the environment that we are living in. We will not, I was just talking to actually a friend of mine, and I was telling her how when I lived in the South, I didn't care too much about what time it was in the evening when I went out, but now I do, right? So just as we do, the urban poor and women living in urban poor communities also experience this. So this particular area that I lived, that I worked in, where these people live, is also sort of, it's a very poor neighborhood, and therefore there are a lot of people selling drugs and those kind of rackets that take place. And there are these groups of boys who hang around at certain points of time in the evening. At times I would be told when I was there for my research that, ma'am, it's time for you to go back, and we will accompany you and drop you till the main road, because the people, the families I was interviewing wanted to ensure that I was safe in the neighborhoods in which they live, right? So some of this is also occasion. So the curbs are also in a certain sense imbibed, and I wouldn't say that people do it in a very purposive manner, but girls sort of grow up to adapt themselves to the environment that they're living in. And this actually points to a much larger structural issue. It is so easy to put the burden on parents and say parents should socialize their children in this manner, or that they should allow their girls to be far more free. It's a very simplistic solution to provide, and it's also very simple to blame individuals, individual parents for the inhibited mobility their girls suffer. But we must accept that there is a larger structural issue, and there is a larger structural addressal of this issue which needs to be made. And here I think it is not just about parents teaching their children. Parents are also in an environment, in a social, in a gendered environment, and they are also therefore teaching their children to adapt to these environments that they are living in. So I just want to give you also another sort of a little bit, from parents I have seen, of Indian parents, with Indian children growing up in Geneva, where I lived for a long time. And there you don't see these kind of constraints in mobility. You see that girls are allowed to go whenever they want to go. They are allowed to travel in the middle of the night because everybody knows the city is safe and there is nothing to worry about, right? So it's actually the same culture group, but operating in a very different way in another part of the world. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that.
Thank you for that response, ma'am.
Yes.
I think Professor Kirti had raised her hand.
Yes.
One second.
Hi, Kirti.
Hi. Okay, I've been stopped from opening my starting my.
Yeah, can you allow her to start her video, please?
No, it's okay. I can understand the technical glitches, but anyways, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation, and your presentations on the theme of care economy do resonate with some of my work as well. But what what caught my attention was performity, like how the performance of, how women perform their, thing when they're involved with some kind of activist struggles with the, Dalit organizations and all. So do you actually see this as a kind of complex performity and performance kind of thing for this whole struggle for, living space, because living spaces matter a lot to women. Also talked about the questions of safety, but also is the whole idea of living space and how women protect their living spaces, and the critical concept of performity. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirti. I think that's actually a twofold question, right? The one on the issue of performativity, and the second one on how, if I understood right, in protecting their living space, they are also in a certain sense performing their gender roles, right? Am I right?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, I think much has to be said about performativity, and I have of course drawn from Judith Butler's work on performativity, and though I'm not an expert on that, what I learned is that to perform is essentially gender norms is in a certain sense rather natural, right? It's we are brought up in a certain way. It would be virtually impossible for any one of us to not perform our gender. But what the take that I have when I examine this performativity is that there are two aspects to this. On the one, on the surface level, when you look at it, you feel that there is a problem here, because in a certain sense gender is being reproduced, right, in the same gendered relations in rather problematic ways, in the ways in which women perform their plight to elicit sympathies of the people that they are negotiating with. But if you were to take a few steps back and to look at this as sort of a form of resistance in which women are looking at a certain objective, which is access to housing. And here I also want to rely on my ethnographic work. For example, there are many narratives in the book on how women, essentially project themselves in front of the slum development officers. There was one scene which I remember very clearly in my head. I can't get that out. Is that in one instance the officer got upset and he said, well, you guys don't own this land, so who asked you to squat on this land? Now you're coming and asking us for these houses. So this woman pretty much took her baby, put her baby on top of the files on this guy's table to say, well, if you were a single woman and you had a child in your arms and no place to go to, no house, nowhere to live, what would you do in my place, right? So I think in a certain sense there are two aspects here. On the one end, you can see it as rather problematic that there is a reproduction of the gender stereotypes or the gendered rules. On the other hand, you can say, well, this is anyway inevitable. Women are going to perform gender in any situation, any given situation. We cannot not perform it, right? But that this performance is rather strategic, and it is strategically employed to resist the state in certain ways. In terms of the living space, now once again, that's another problem theoretically, right? When we talk about everyday politics and what happens within neighborhoods, within streets, already there is a certain grayness. There's very little known on what actually transpires in streets, in neighborhoods. What is far more visual are these protests, are those, once in a while events. And that's the reason why in the study of these struggles, we have a lot more literature on social movements, for instance, as compared to everyday politics, right? And perhaps one reason is also because it takes a lot more effort to sort of chronicle this on a regular basis. It takes a concerted amount of ethnographic detailing to understand what is happening within neighborhoods. But women's role within these spaces, and that is essentially the point that I make, is that very frequently when urban sociologists or people who are looking at social movements and struggles are looking at the meso level, women don't appear. They are virtually absent. It's only when you go to the micro level and when you do this kind of detailing that you realize that most of that work at the meso level is built up through the work that women conduct at the micro level. So that has been one attempt that I have made to sort of break this, this tendency within urban anthropology to focus on the meso level, to sort of bring it a little lower and therefore visibilize women who are otherwise invisible in urban poor struggles. And here you again, again land up in that same question, right? Are they again performing their gender, staying within the neighborhood, the confines of the neighborhood? And my take has been that you can't look at it in a very simplistic manner. You must realize, for instance, the transformation that these women are responsible for within their neighborhoods. Even during my research in 2009, when I started, to 2015, when it finished, there were 2 additional classrooms in the local school because of the activism of these women, right? There were roads on many of those streets which were otherwise not tarred. Now, when you look at that, when you look at the work of developing these neighborhoods, and this work doesn't take place overnight, it's through a lot of everyday, politics. And when you look at that, you realize that you need to sort of have a rather complex and nuanced view of gendered roles. And this is auto-assigned, right? Women are sort of relegating themselves to certain kinds of work. They don't want to be at the meso level. They prefer to be within their neighborhoods. You can either problematize that, or you can pay attention to what effects it has on the economic upliftment of these groups, and therefore how important this work is. So that has been a little bit my effort in this book. Thank you. I think somebody else raised their hand. I hope my answer was not too long and I did not dissuade them from
Not at all, ma'am. I think it was Priti. She's been made the co-host, so you may unmute yourself and ask the question now.
Hi, thank you, Professor Kaveri, for that talk. No, I actually lowered my hand because you answered my question.
Oh, I see.
No, it's a wonderful research that you've done on, and I really enjoyed the talk, especially because it resonated with the work that I've done in slums. So like when you were talking about your safety in getting out of that neighborhood. So I have seen while I was coming out of Bhavana, the drugs being exchanged, and I was like, okay, I need to get out of here. And this idea of displaying plight versus coming forth as warriors, I think it's gender being performed in a certain way by the urban poor, but somehow I think it resonates with women of upper classes, lower middle classes in white collar jobs as well, as to how to negotiate with a predominantly male working setup and masculine rules of existing and operating. And I actually wanted to ask, like you partly answered it, how successful has this been, or if being warrior versus negotiating, putting across their misery, what has worked, and what are the kind of development improvements and access to basic services that the women have been able to gain? And I understand it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long struggle, especially if the counselor changes, or there would be a change in the commissioner of the municipal corporation. So there are those kind of changes which happen. So you have to establish that relation from start, whether it's the local ACP, DCP in terms of providing security, domestic violence. So because you hinted on all these so many aspects, I was actually, I could go on and on asking questions.
Yeah. So maybe I will just pick this one aspect that you talked about, right? I mean, the very fact, and maybe one of my efforts in this book is also to sort of break that. We tend to think about slums as sort of dependent, so there's a lot of literature on dependency, patron-client relations. And some of this is so repeated, oft-repeated, that you sort of, I mean, we live in a world where when you say a lot of the same thing many, many times, it becomes true. So this is one of those things that we sort of take for granted. And my effort has been to say, well, this is happening, and we know that there are vote banks. We know that these politicians are dependent on these people, and they have a vested interest in keeping them where they are, right? So that is something I totally accept. And this is something that also women are constantly talking about, right? They are saying, why is it that we are in the same place that we are in, and our children are having to grow up here? And in the manner in which they are understanding their own lives, and they are understanding that they're being trapped into these situations of poverty, you see some amount of hope, right? That there is a certain subjectivity that is emanating from these women, and they are not fools. I think the tendency has also been for us to say, well, these people will go and vote for them, and they will just close their eyes and vote for them because they're getting money. And this is not what I saw in my research. In fact, many women who were politically mobilizing for one party would vote for the other party, So there is a good amount of agency out there, and people know what situations they are living in, and they know who can do what for them, and what they can get out of one person versus the other person. So my effort in this book has been to sort of deconstruct that and to say, well, okay, we understand there is dependency. We know politicians depend on them, they depend on politicians, but can we also take a back seat and see what's happening to their lives over generations? And this is where I was interested, because I worked with families, not with individuals. So I would normally interview both the husband as well as the wife, and very frequently the daughter or the son, because these would be adults working in nearby in the areas. And what you see is that over a period of time, they are consolidating themselves, and they are able to sort of, if not completely rise out of those conditions of life, at least marginally improve themselves. The other thing, as I said, the physical transformation of that neighborhood, even in 6 years, was palpable, right? So you could see that all of this seemed to be having an effect, right? Even if it was those small trickles of, welfare benefits or support, or the tarring of a road, or the putting up of one single light, or one extra tap which came up in a particular area, you see that they are able to marginally improve themselves. And this, I realize, all the while, I am talking not about a slum, right? You worked in a slum, but I'm talking about so-called legal housing. This is legal housing provided by the state. And these people are essentially removed from actually very well-serviced slums in the middle of the city. In fact, their lives were much better off there. And they are put into this housing where there is nothing. There is actually nothing. Some of the newer rehabilitation areas that are coming up in the peripheries of Bangalore, if you visit them, they are a horror story. It's a horror story, right? I mean, not only are they very badly, poorly constructed, but if they are in the middle of nowhere, nobody can live there, nobody can work there, nothing can be done. So a large part of this research is also trying to, sort of break that schism between a slum and subsidized housing, because a lot of times we read literature on public-private partnerships and whether they're working for rehabilitation housing or not, but this question on what happens to them. And this is a very important question. This is happening to all of these people in various parts of the country, that they are actually going into legal housing, but they are in worse off conditions than the slums that they left, right? So the question is also, I think, when we're talking about illegal settlements, we make that analogy. We say, okay, they are illegal to begin with, so they cannot get all of this.
Yeah.
So my approach here has been, well, look, here is a legal place, and they still have exactly the same conditions of life. So they have not been able to get out of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So on the one hand, to show that there has been change in their lives, that women are responsible for actually the massive amount of the development work in the neighborhood. It's women who are doing that,
Women,
right?
yes, exactly.
To make visible that work and to say that this progress is taking place, at the cost of women, struggling and putting in their work. But at the same time, also telling you that, well, listen, the state is at the same time, doing nothing, pretty much virtually nothing. So you see the shifting of the burden, the state virtually pretty much shifts its burden on the shoulders of poor women. So it's pretty much in the line of much of this discussion on the feminization of poverty. You see similar modes of, the responsibility, state responsibility being thrust on poor women in this case, right? So that has been that balance that I have tried to strike. On the one hand, to say, well, because it's so easy to also fall in love with this entrepreneurial slum kind of literature, right? You can begin to think of them as heroes and warriors, but you need to know they are working within these limitations, that they are actually not responsible for the conditions of life that they are living there, that they are working under extreme hardship, right? So that has been a sort of an approach, not a Padurai's celebratory, approach, but sort of find a middle ground where I can see both these things happening.
Yeah, I think the situation in Delhi, this marginalization in the name of under the rehabilitation policy and the relocation of slums to the outskirts, like Bhavana in Delhi is one of those rehabilitation areas, even Bhalaswa, which we crossed to go to our campus, that has a landfill next to it. These people were far better off in the city on illegal land. It was scary. I mean, we can't, and a lot of the housing has not been occupied. People have moved back.
So, and the same, for example, if you look at Karen Coelho's work on Kannagi Nagar, right? That is also essentially the same situation. So you have a lot of studies of rehabilitation housing emanating. But the focus in a lot of these studies has been, okay, this housing is poor and it's bad and whatever. But then, what is the reason? Why is it bad? Why is it that the state does not do this? So to some extent, my book also explores what is the interest of the state in ensuring these conditions, right? So the state is a very interested party, and the state officers, bureaucrats, politicians, they all gain substantially from this sort of rehabilitation mechanism, right? So that is pretty much my one of the chapters of my book, which looks at why this happens, to try and understand through ethnographic detail how corruption works and how corruption is part of that answer. And it's not just merely that these houses were poor quality, but they were meant to be of poor quality so that tenders can be issued 20 years later to reconstruct, to demolish a 3-story house and construct a 6-story house in the place, a 6-story apartment building in the place of this. And money can be made of those tenders, as well as money can be made of all the extra allotments of those houses, right? So there is a mechanism, there is a system in place that actually thrives on this happening, and that has actually been the core of this book.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'll definitely go through the book and I'll meet you on campus. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Kruti.
Yes, I know the time has been up, but would you be open to answering one more follow-up question?
Yeah, I can see Devyani's question is quite an interesting question also, and I think in a sense I also agree with her. She says performative activism can be problematic in the sense that they are playing around with the existing gender roles and stereotypes that see women as beings who are only restricted to reproductive and caring roles. But as you mentioned, this method works in getting what they want. So how can they kind of navigate themselves out of this paradoxical situation where they don't have to put themselves in the patriarchal boxes, but also be heard and have a voice in their local economic and political realm? So Devyani, I think this is like, it's a little bit like, what should they do to get out of it, right? There I'm honestly a little bit at a loss because I don't really know what they can do. But at the same time, I'm also sort of, thinking of some of these interviews that I've had with women in these various groups, especially ones who played a little bit of a leading role, even if they were not the main leader of the slum. And there you see potential, right? These are women who know what they are doing. They are sort of document keepers within their families. right? So they are managers of everything concerned to the home, including property papers and those kind of things. So even as you come down, even women who are not very active in politics are still very conscious of their legal situation. You know, do they have the allotment paper? Do they not have an allotment paper? And in this consciousness and this awareness, already I see a lot of potential. So I would think that it's only a matter of time, and hopefully soon we will see a lot more women engaging in leadership positions. But at the same time, I know, like I said, there are many examples that I can give you where this kind of sort of state paternalism is being, activated, right? So you look at the state like you look at a protector, huh? Your father or your brother, and you're seeking out the protection of the state. But at the same time, these women are also challenging the state in terms of their exclusion as citizens. So in that itself, I think even if these roles are problematic, as Butler would say, it is normative, it's something that is being reproduced over and over again. But if there is some form of resistance, it may not necessarily be resistance to gender norms, but resistance to other categories of exclusion, then there is potential, right? It is still something that we need to pay attention to, right? So I think I will stop here. We're already quite ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. Now Suparna will give the ending vote of thanks.
Is she there, Suparna?
So I think she's having some problem. I think she's unable to unmute. So okay.
Yeah, she's there.
No, I can unmute now. Yeah, I've been given permission. So we would really like to thank you, Dr. Kaveri, for answering our questions in such depth and detail, and also for the insightful talk, and especially the anecdotes, which I personally found very interesting. And we're very grateful to be introduced to such a pertinent but such an overlooked case study. So it was really a pleasure to hear about this from someone with your experience and your expertise. And and it was really an honor to have you here with us. And we also would like to wish you. And with this, we would like to conclude our seminar for today. And thank you everybody for attending and taking out the time on a weekend. And do visit our website and follow our social media handles for such content and future seminars. And we have also posted a few links on the chat for your ease. And on behalf of FEPI, we would like to thank everybody for joining again today. And please stay safe and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Suparna, Tejasvi, as well as Tanya. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.